Ayana stumbled through the dense underbrush, her small feet sinking into the damp earth with every step. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a labyrinth of towering trees whose thick canopies blocked the sun, leaving the world beneath in perpetual twilight. Shadows danced across the moss-covered trunks, and the air smelled of wet leaves, soil, and the faint tang of something wild and untamed. She clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders, which offered little warmth against the chill that seeped into her bones. Her heart pounded furiously, echoing the panic that gripped her young chest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, set her nerves on edge, and she could feel her own pulse in her throat, heavy and insistent. It had been her family, those she had trusted most, who had betrayed her. The memory burned sharply in her mind, the faces of her parents twisted in false affection, and then cruelty. They had led her deep into the forest under the guise of a simple errand, praising her obedience, smiling as they walked beside her. And then, without warning, they had vanished, leaving her alone among the ancient trees, their laughter echoing faintly before disappearing entirely. The betrayal felt physical, like a knife pressed against her chest, and tears she hadn't realized were forming fell freely down her cheeks, leaving streaks in the dirt on her face. She screamed once, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the woods, and the only reply was the whispering of the wind through the leaves, the rustling of branches overhead. Ayana's mind raced as she tried to comprehend the enormity of her situation. She had no food, no water, no knowledge of where to go, and every instinct told her to run, to hide, to survive. Yet the forest seemed alive, observing her, holding her in some quiet, watchful tension. The trees towered like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches stretching out as if to touch her, and the undergrowth threatened to ensnare her at every turn. The darkness of the forest floor seemed almost tangible, pressing against her with a weight that made her knees wobble, forcing her to lean against the nearest tree for support. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and every step forward felt like an effort against an invisible hand trying to push her backward into despair. Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time seemed to dissolve in the forest, replaced by the endless green and brown of leaves and bark. Ayana's stomach growled painfully, reminding her that she was not only lost but starving. She had always been a child of the village, used to the warmth of the fire and the taste of fresh bread, to the sound of familiar voices calling her name. Now there was only the forest, an unending sea of green and shadow, indifferent to her suffering. She stumbled over a root and fell forward, scraping her palms and knees, and her cry of pain blended with the distant call of a lone bird somewhere in the canopy above. Fear gripped her even more tightly, tightening around her chest like a vice, and she struggled to stand, shaking with both cold and terror. She tried to call out, hoping someone might hear her, anyone, perhaps a traveler, perhaps a kind soul who wandered into these woods, but her voice seemed fragile, swallowed immediately by the oppressive silence of the forest. The trees themselves appeared to lean closer, their leaves whispering secrets she could not understand, their shadows stretching long and ominous across the forest floor. Every rustle, every crack, made her jump violently, heart hammering in her chest, mind spinning with imagined dangers. What beasts lurked beyond the next thicket? What eyes watched her from the darkness, calculating her every move? She could not tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at her like an insistent hunger. As the sun dipped lower, sending shafts of fading light through the canopy, Ayana realized she could not see any familiar path. Her sense of direction, honed from playing near the village fields, betrayed her completely. She spun in circles, dizzy with exhaustion and fear, until finally collapsing against a massive oak. Its trunk was rough beneath her palms, its presence both threatening and strangely comforting, as if the ancient tree bore silent witness to her suffering. She curled up against it, shivering, the darkness pressing against her like a physical weight, and for a long while she simply wept, letting the tears flow freely, mourning both her lost home and the betrayal that had cast her into this unforgiving wilderness. The forest around her seemed alive with whispers. The wind carried faint murmurs that might have been imagined, or perhaps they were the trees themselves, communicating in a language older than human memory. Ayana lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder, and for the first time she felt the subtle pulse of the forest, an awareness that stretched through the roots and trunks, through the canopy above. Though she was alone, truly abandoned by those she had loved, she sensed that the forest had noticed her, that it was listening. This awareness, faint as it was, offered a fragile thread of hope in a world that had seemed utterly merciless. Night fell fully, the forest deepening into near-complete darkness. Shadows thickened around her, and strange, unidentifiable sounds echoed in the distance. Calls of nocturnal creatures, the sigh of wind over leaves, the distant crash of a branch. Ayana's fear intensified. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, to protect herself from whatever might emerge from the darkness. Yet she could not leave the spot against the oak. Her body had no strength left to move, and her mind was too overwhelmed to make sense of a path forward. She was trapped between despair and the faint, elusive hope that maybe, just maybe, she was not entirely alone. In the heart of that forest, surrounded by shadows and whispers, by fear and exhaustion, Ayana understood the depth of her abandonment. Her family's betrayal had thrust her into a world wild and untamed, where survival depended on courage she had not yet discovered. Yet as she pressed herself against the tree, shivering and trembling, she also sensed a quiet resilience awakening within her, a fragile but undeniable spark. The forest, immense and ancient, seemed to acknowledge her presence, and in its watching, there was both danger and protection. Ayana closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe in the damp, earthy scent of the woods, and in that instant she became aware that her story in the forest was only beginning. She did not know what awaited her beyond the shadows, what trials the night would bring, or what creatures lurked unseen. But for the first time since her abandonment, Ayana felt a whisper of determination, a seed of courage taking root amid the fear. Though alone, though betrayed, though trembling in the dark, she was alive, and the forest, vast and mysterious, had taken note of the girl left in its depths, a girl whose pain it would one day remember. The forest around Ayana was no ordinary place. It breathed and shifted with a life all its own. Every tree seemed to stretch taller, its gnarled limbs twisting as if sensing the presence of the girl who had been cruelly abandoned within its depths. Moss clung thickly to the trunks, and roots snaked across the forest floor like the veins of some enormous ancient creature. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, yet beneath it all lingered a subtle sweetness, as though the forest exhaled its own quiet magic. Ayana's small footsteps stirred the fallen leaves, and the sound echoed strangely, as if the ground itself responded to her passage. She could feel it, an awareness surrounding her, pressing lightly against her back, brushing her hair with invisible fingers. It was as though unseen eyes followed her every movement, watching with patience, curiosity, and perhaps judgment. The whispers of the leaves carried faint patterns of words that she could not comprehend, but which resonated deep within her chest, making her heart race with both fear and awe. The rustling above was not merely wind, it was a dialogue, a murmur of sentient branches speaking to one another about the intruder in their midst. Shadows moved in subtle rhythms, bending and swaying, and the faint glimmer of light through the canopy seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Everywhere Ayana looked, the forest revealed hints of its ancient consciousness. Birds, normally shy and wary, perched boldly on low branches, tilting their heads as if observing her intentions. Tiny animals darted between roots and brush, yet never threatened her. Instead, they seemed to acknowledge her presence, allowing her passage through their domain. Even the air itself felt alive, thick with a subtle vibration that she could sense in her bones. The forest was not passive, it remembered, and it was beginning to register the pain that had brought her here. As she ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost tangible in its sentience. Branches arched overhead to form natural corridors, guiding her path as if the forest itself were leading her. Occasionally, the ground trembled beneath her feet in faint, imperceptible pulses, like the heartbeat of some ancient being slumbering beneath layers of roots and soil. Shadows shifted unnaturally, lingering just beyond the corner of her eye, suggesting the presence of watchers who had existed for centuries. The wind carried voices, fragmented but insistent, murmuring in languages older than memory. Though she could not understand them, their tone conveyed something unmistakable. The forest knew her suffering and it would not forget. A sudden breeze rustled through the leaves, and the trees seemed to lean closer, almost protectively, as if sensing the fragile fragility of the human heart that wandered beneath their boughs. Ayana froze, feeling the brush of unseen hands across her shoulders, the faint touch of energy against her skin. Goosebumps rose in response, not from cold but from the awe-inspiring realization that she was not entirely alone. The forest itself had acknowledged her existence, had registered the betrayal she had suffered, and was already beginning to weave that memory into its vast, unending consciousness. Deeper still, the woods grew denser, the shadows darker, and the sounds of life more complex. Strange patterns of light filtered through the canopy in irregular pulses, casting fleeting shapes upon the ground that flickered like ghosts. Leaves quivered with anticipation, small animals froze mid-step, and the forest seemed to hold its collective breath. Ayana's heart pounded in response. Every instinct screamed at her to run, yet she was rooted in awe, feeling the pulse of power that thrummed invisibly around her. She realized then that the forest was not merely watching, it was alive in every sense of the word, aware of each step, each tremor of emotion, and most importantly, each pang of her suffering. The deeper she went, the more she felt an undeniable connection forming between herself and the forest. It was as if the very soil beneath her feet could absorb the weight of her despair, and the whispering leaves carried fragments of her sorrow upward, into the ancient canopy. Branches swayed rhythmically, guiding her path without her conscious choice, protecting her from unseen hazards, and even the sunlight seemed to filter differently, casting warm glimmers that led her steps. Each element of the forest acted in concert, responding to her presence and her emotions, silently affirming that her pain was neither ignored nor forgotten. As night approached, the forest's sentience became even more apparent. Shadows lengthened and merged into deeper darkness, yet the trees seemed to form protective barriers around her, enclosing her in a cocoon of ancient power. Strange, luminous fungi glowed faintly along roots and tree trunks, marking safe paths while keeping danger at bay. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the snapping of twigs, felt purposeful, deliberate, and orchestrated by a consciousness far older than any human. Ayana, exhausted but increasingly aware of her unique position in this living world, began to sense that she had allies here, even if their nature was entirely foreign. By the time she stopped to rest beneath a colossal tree, she understood a fundamental truth. The forest was not merely a backdrop for her fear, it was a living, remembering entity. Her abandonment, her suffering, her loneliness, all of it had been registered, woven into the endless memory of the woods. And though she did not yet know how, the forest would act in accordance with that memory. It would protect, guide, and when the time came, defend her. As she closed her eyes against the growing darkness, feeling the subtle pulse of life around her, Ayana realized that she was no longer entirely powerless. The forest had awakened, and her pain had not been in vain. It would remember and it would rise. Ayana shivered against the rough bark of a towering tree, the forest around her alive with the whispers of wind through leaves, the low rustle of unseen creatures, and the faint creak of branches swaying above. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift, though the memories that surfaced were bitter and relentless. Her family, the people who were supposed to love and protect her, had been the architects of her suffering. The faces of her parents flickered in her memory, smiles that had once seemed warm now twisting into cruel masks of indifference. They had praised her obedience when it suited them, their eyes bright with affection, only to turn cold and calculating at the first opportunity to exert control. Their words, once gentle, had become sharp knives that cut deeper than any physical pain, each syllable soaked in expectation, jealousy, and manipulation. She remembered the day it had begun in earnest, the day her little successes, her innocent triumphs, and her quiet joys had sparked envy in her stepmother's heart. Lady Ebel, with her sharp eyes and constant disapproval, had never tolerated Ayana's natural curiosity and gentle nature. A simple act of kindness toward a neighbor or a moment of laughter with her younger siblings could earn her a scolding so severe it left bruises on her spirit that no balm could soothe. Each punishment, each whispered insult, was a carefully designed lesson in submission, a reminder that her place in the family was never secure, that her love would always be conditional. The injustice escalated steadily, unnoticed by those who should have intervened. Her father, once a man she trusted implicitly, had grown distant, entangled in his own preoccupations, and blind to the subtle poison spreading through their home. Her stepmother's words, cloaked in concern and feigned affection, twisted him slowly, bending his judgment until he saw Ayana as a threat rather than a child to be cherished. They began to whisper behind closed doors about curses, misfortune, and ominous signs. They claimed Ayana's curiosity and her independent spirit were dangerous, that she was destined to bring shame or ruin to the household. The girl who had once been hugged and praised, whose laughter had once filled the halls, was now a shadow, an unwanted presence whose very existence provoked fear and suspicion. The final betrayal had come swiftly and without warning. One morning, the family had pretended an urgent errand, coaxing her to follow deep into the forest. They had spoken gently, their words laced with honeyed lies and smiles that should have comforted her. And then, without hesitation, they had turned and left, disappearing into the dense foliage as though she had been nothing more than an object to be discarded. Ayana had called out, her voice trembling and breaking, but there was no answer, no return, no comfort, only the oppressive embrace of the forest. The sting of betrayal had settled in her chest, heavy and unyielding, and for the first time she felt the raw, terrifying weight of complete abandonment. As she sat beneath the ancient tree, the forest seemed to lean closer, as if recognizing the gravity of her pain. Her tears fell freely onto the mossy ground, mingling with the earthy scent of decay and growth. The forest, in its strange, sentient way, was alive to her suffering. Each rustle of leaves, each creaking branch, and each shifting shadow seemed to echo her emotions, resonating with a deep, almost mystical empathy. She began to sense that this place, this dense, unknowable wilderness, could be both a prison and a sanctuary. It was fraught with danger, unseen predators, treacherous roots, and the gnawing uncertainty of a child alone. Yet it was also a refuge, untainted by the deceit and cruelty of those who had abandoned her. Here the trees listened. Here the wind whispered truths. Here the earth beneath her fingers remembered. Over time, Ayana began to build an emotional connection to the forest, a fragile bond born of necessity and survival. She came to recognize its rhythms, the way the light shifted through the canopy at different hours, the particular calls of birds that seemed to guide her path, the subtle changes in the wind that warned of approaching storms or predators. In this living world, she found both solace and strength. The forest was not a cold, indifferent entity. It was aware, protective, and patient, learning her habits, anticipating her needs, and holding her secrets close. She felt her heart begin to resonate with the pulse of the woods, a rhythm older and steadier than human cruelty, a constant reminder that she was seen and acknowledged, even when abandoned by those she had trusted most. The contrast between her family's betrayal and the forest's silent acceptance was stark and profound. Every pang of loneliness and sorrow reminded her of the warmth she had lost, yet each comforting rustle, each protective shadow, each subtle guidance from the underbrush reminded her that she was not entirely alone. The forest remembered. It bore witness to her suffering in a way her family never had, and it promised, though she could not yet comprehend the full extent, that this memory would shape her future. Night fell over the forest, and the shadows deepened into an inky blackness, yet Ayana did not feel completely afraid. She pressed herself against the tree, feeling the rough bark beneath her palms, and sensed the steady heartbeat of the forest around her. The whispers of leaves carried faint hints of encouragement, and the faint shimmer of bioluminescent fungi traced delicate patterns along the roots, illuminating safe paths. Her sorrow remained, heavy and unyielding, but it was tempered by the quiet knowledge that the forest was alive with awareness, that it remembered, and that in its own ancient way, it had begun to guard her. As she drifted into a restless sleep beneath the trees, Ayana understood something fundamental. Her family's cruelty had cast her into the wilderness, but the forest, in its vast patience and unspoken wisdom, would become her teacher, her protector, and one day the instrument of her justice. The betrayal that had left her abandoned had planted a seed of connection with a living world that was older, wiser, and far stronger than the treachery of human hearts. The forest would not forget, and neither would she. Ayana awoke to the faint light of dawn filtering through the dense canopy above, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. The night had been long and filled with uneasy dreams, but something felt different in the air. The forest seemed to hum softly, a vibration she could feel in her chest rather than hear. As she rose to her feet, brushing dirt and leaves from her tattered clothes, she noticed the underbrush shifting in ways that defied explanation. Vines curled gently, moving as if alive, parting to create a narrow path for her to walk without tripping over roots or stumbling into thorny bushes. She froze, wide-eyed, certain she had imagined the movement, yet the subtle sway of the greenery told her otherwise. A soft rustle to her left drew her gaze to a cluster of small creatures, squirrels and birds, who appeared unusually calm in her presence. Normally they would flee at the first hint of a human, but now they paused, tilting their heads as if observing her intentions. A squirrel scuttled along a low branch and chattered insistently, leading her attention toward a safer path through the dense trees. As she followed the guidance of these tiny animals, Ayana felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, a curious sense that the forest itself was aware of her, guiding her steps and shielding her from hidden dangers. The ground beneath her feet seemed to soften in certain places and firm in others, almost as if the earth itself was adjusting to her presence, ensuring her balance as she navigated the uneven terrain. Each careful step was accompanied by subtle movements around her, leaves brushing gently against her arms to steady her, twigs bending away from her path before she could stub her toes. The sensation was both startling and comforting, a silent reassurance that though she had been abandoned by her family, she was not entirely alone in this vast, wild expanse. At one point, Ayana stumbled over a hidden root, but a sudden, almost imperceptible tug of a nearby vine seemed to catch her before she fell. She looked down, amazed, but no living thing was visible holding her up. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and wonder, and she realized that the forest itself was beginning to act on her behalf. It was subtle at first, small nudges, gentle shifts, but the intent was unmistakable. The trees, the undergrowth, and even the smallest creatures were responding to her presence in ways that transcended natural explanation. As she continued, Ayana noticed more signs. A broken branch fell behind her just as a predator's eyes glinted from the shadows, steering it away from her path. The sunlight filtering through the canopy seemed to linger longer on certain leaves, casting guiding beams that illuminated the safest route. Birds swooped and chirped not randomly, but in patterns that caught her attention and helped her navigate the twists and turns of the forest. She began to sense a rhythm, a pulse that connected all living things around her, and felt that it was in some way tied to her own heartbeat. By midday, Ayana's initial fear had started to shift into cautious awe. She had survived encounters with hidden roots, steep embankments, and sudden drops, guided each time by imperceptible cues from the forest. Every protective act, from the gentle sway of vines to the sudden movement of small animals, strengthened her belief that she was not merely wandering aimlessly in the wilderness. The forest was watching, learning, and responding. It remembered her pain, and now, in subtle ways, it was beginning to shield her. She paused beside a small clearing where sunlight poured in unbroken, illuminating the delicate flowers that had sprouted from the damp soil. A soft wind stirred the petals, brushing them lightly against her hands, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as if the forest itself was communicating in a language beyond words, a language of touch, movement, and intuition. Ayana realized that her presence mattered, that her existence in this place had awakened a dormant energy within the trees, the earth, and the creatures that called the forest home. As evening approached, the protective signs grew more pronounced. Vines lifted to form a barrier around her resting spot, shielding her from biting insects and unseen eyes. Owls perched nearby, silent sentinels keeping watch while she slept. Every sound, every movement, every gentle shift in the air spoke of a forest that had acknowledged her, recognized her suffering, and decided to act in her defense. Lying beneath the shelter of a large, ancient tree, Ayana finally allowed herself to relax, her eyes drifting to the canopy above where the last rays of sunlight filtered through in golden streaks. She felt a bond forming, tenuous yet undeniable, with the living world around her. The forest had awakened, not fully perhaps, but enough for her to sense its presence and its intention. It was learning, adapting, and protecting, and she could feel, deep in her bones, that this connection would only grow stronger with time. In that moment, for the first time since her abandonment, Ayana felt a glimmer of hope. She was no longer utterly alone, and the forest had begun to remember her pain. The villagers of Alyawana, a small settlement bordering the dense forest, were steeped in superstition, their minds quick to blame misfortune on forces beyond their understanding. Rumors had spread about Ayana's disappearance, twisted by fear and envy into whispers of curses and witchcraft. Some claimed that she had angered the spirits of the forest, that her family's betrayal had left a scar upon the land itself, and that those who ventured too close might never return. Her family, too, carried guilt and fear masquerading as righteousness. They believed that retrieving her, or punishing her, was necessary to restore honor and appease the restless spirits. As the first light of dawn touched the treetops, groups of villagers gathered at the forest's edge. Their faces were drawn tight with worry and suspicion. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers under trembling breaths, while older men brandished crude staffs and machetes, ready to confront whatever darkness they imagined lurked beyond the treeline. Ayana's family, draped in long somber garments, pushed forward, their eyes haunted by the deeds that had led to her abandonment. They spoke little, their silence thick with shame and dread, but their presence sent ripples of unease through the villagers. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified by fear, feeding their belief that the forest was already conspiring against them. They moved cautiously, forming small clusters as they entered the shadowed forest, each step hesitant yet determined. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and every branch that brushed against their shoulders felt like a warning. Some of the younger villagers trembled visibly, their wide eyes darting toward shifting shadows that might have been nothing more than the play of sunlight on leaves. Others muttered incantations and protective charms under their breaths, hoping to shield themselves from what they feared might be Ayana's wrath, unaware that it was not she but the forest that observed them. The forest, ancient and sentient, responded in subtle ways to their intrusion. Vines shifted slightly, creating natural obstacles that slowed their progress, while branches bent and swayed as though steering them away from certain paths. Birds alighted on high branches, their calls eerily synchronized, giving the illusion of a chorus of voices mocking the intruders. Small creatures darted in and out of sight, drawing the villagers' attention and distracting them from the trail. Each obstacle seemed minor in isolation but collectively formed a labyrinth designed to confuse and protect, ensuring that Ayana's hiding place remained undiscovered. Despite their fear, the villagers pressed onward. They called her name, their voices trembling with desperation and superstition. "Ayana, child of the forest, return to us." But the wind carried their words away, scattering them through the canopy until they dissolved into the rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest itself refused to deliver her presence to those who sought her harm, or perhaps to those who sought her at all. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest's protective nature became evident. Roots seemed to shift beneath their feet, tripping them or redirecting their paths. Shadows moved unnaturally, making the familiar terrain feel alien and threatening. Their fear grew with each misstep. Elders whispered about curses and spirits, citing old tales of children lost to the forest's hunger, of humans who were swallowed whole by ancient magic when they disrespected the sacred woods. Some villagers, emboldened by superstition, began to speak openly of the need to punish Ayana if she were found, to prevent her supposed wrath from destroying crops, livestock, or even entire families. Their words, heavy with fear and anger, seemed to echo off the towering trees, stirring a quiet, deliberate response from the forest itself. As the sun climbed higher, the forest's power became increasingly apparent. Paths they thought they recognized shifted subtly, leading them in circles. Water trickled silently where streams should have flowed, and sudden gusts of wind obscured their sight, scattering dust and leaves in erratic patterns. Every attempt to corner or track Ayana was met with invisible resistance, as though the woods themselves were steering, blocking, and confusing them. Each misstep heightened their anxiety, and soon the villagers' coordinated search dissolved into scattered groups, fearful and uncertain. By midday, tension and superstition had reached a peak. Some villagers accused one another of conspiring with Ayana or the forest, pointing fingers and hurling bitter words. Shadows beneath the ancient trees deepened, and the once welcoming canopy became a maze of looming silhouettes that amplified every sound. Footsteps echoed strangely, twigs snapped under imaginary threats, and faint rustles in the undergrowth were interpreted as the approach of the cursed girl herself. Their fear had transformed the forest into a place of terror, even though the true threat was not Ayana but the villagers' own imagination amplified by the sentience of the woods. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, the forest's subtle protections continued to assert themselves. Vines shifted to obscure hidden thickets, branches created false paths, and small animals guided themselves into the villagers' sight to distract and mislead. They moved with purpose, but every step reinforced the lesson that the forest remembered, that it acted in response to intentions, and that it would not allow harm to reach the child it had begun to protect. Ayana, hidden in the shadows of towering trees, felt a strange comfort witnessing the fear of those who had once been her family and community. She sensed that the forest's memory was precise, that it held on to every detail of injustice, and that it would rise to defend her when the time came. By evening, the villagers' search had yielded nothing but confusion, bruised egos, and whispered accusations. They had entered the forest full of certainty, seeking to impose control and punishment, but emerged with the unmistakable understanding that this was no ordinary place. The sentience of the woods had turned their fear inward, reflecting their guilt, envy, and superstition back at them. Ayana, though unseen and unheard, felt the satisfaction of knowing that the forest was her ally and her shield. It remembered her pain, guided her steps, and silently yet unmistakably, was already preparing to rise in her defense. The forest responded with a sudden, palpable surge of power, as if Ayana's presence had awakened an ancient memory buried in its roots and branches. Roots, thick and gnarled, began to twist and writhe across the forest floor, emerging from the earth like serpents, curling around rocks and fallen logs. They shifted with purpose, forming natural barricades that blocked the villagers' paths and sent them stumbling back in confusion. The air vibrated with energy, carrying the faint scent of moss, sap, and something almost metallic, a warning of the forest's sentient anger. Branches overhead swayed violently, though no wind stirred. They arched downward, forming jagged barriers that intercepted the villagers' attempts to push forward. Leaves rustled in a chorus of warning, whispering in a language older than human memory. The sunlight filtering through the canopy flickered as if the trees themselves were breathing, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that mirrored the pulse of life beneath the soil. Every step the intruders took was met with subtle resistance. Rocks shifted beneath their feet, roots tangled around ankles, and thickets grew denser with every attempt to penetrate the forest's heart. Small animals moved strategically to distract and mislead. Birds swooped low, drawing the villagers' attention to false trails, while squirrels and rabbits darted past their feet, disappearing into protective underbrush. The forest's protective energy was deliberate and intelligent, guiding Ayana safely while confusing and repelling the humans who sought to harm her. It was not random. Every movement had intent, as if the forest were conscious of both the danger and the need to shield its chosen ward. Ayana, hidden within a cluster of dense ferns, felt a strange warmth emanating from the surrounding trees. Her heart raced, but not with fear. The subtle sway of the canopy above and the twisting roots below made her feel cradled, protected by something far greater than herself. It was a profound connection, a silent communication between the girl and the ancient living world around her. Every crack of a branch, every tremor in the earth, was a reassurance. She was safe here, and the forest would not allow harm to reach her. The villagers pressed on, their fear intensifying as the forest's defense became increasingly obvious. Vines whipped across their faces, roots snagged their feet, and thick branches lowered to block their view and their path. Some cried out in frustration, accusing one another of sorcery and evil, while others attempted to force their way forward with crude tools and weapons. Each effort was thwarted effortlessly by the natural barriers, leaving the intruders exhausted, bewildered, and terrified. Above, the tallest trees seemed to lean toward each other, their massive limbs locking into a protective lattice that made the forest appear impenetrable. The canopy thickened unnaturally, casting the ground below in shadows that shifted and danced, disorienting those who dared to enter. Faint glimmers of light, bioluminescent fungi and the reflected shimmer of dew, marked safe paths for Ayana but misled the villagers at every turn. It was as though the forest itself was alive, aware of her vulnerability and the intruder's intent, responding with precision and purpose. From the ground, the roots coiled like living serpents around the feet of the intruders, tripping them and forcing them backward. Branches snapped into defensive positions, forming spikes and barriers that prevented any approach to Ayana's hidden location. The wind carried whispers that stirred doubt, fear, and remorse in the hearts of the villagers, echoing their own guilt back at them. Each obstacle reinforced the forest's will, a living testament to its memory of her suffering and its determination to protect her at all costs. Ayana watched in awe, feeling an unspoken bond with every living thing around her. She sensed the subtle energies in the air, the vibrations through the roots, and the careful choreography of creatures both great and small. The forest had remembered her pain, and now it acted as an extension of her own emerging power, rising to shield her from those who would exploit or harm her. Even as the intruders screamed, cursed, and stumbled blindly through the twisting maze, Ayana remained untouched, cradled in the living embrace of a forest that would not forget, a forest that had begun to fight for her before she even understood the extent of her own strength. By twilight, the villagers retreated, exhausted and terrified, while Ayana remained safely hidden within the dense undergrowth. The forest, having defended its ward, seemed to settle once more, the branches lowering, the roots retreating slightly, and the air growing calm. Yet the energy lingered, a quiet promise that it would rise again, more forceful and deliberate if ever the need arose. For now, Ayana was safe, shielded by a living, breathing guardian that had learned her story, remembered her suffering, and would rise to defend her whenever necessary. Ayana felt a subtle shift within her as the forest's energy continued to envelop her. The pulse of the earth beneath her bare feet, the hum of wind through the leaves, and the rhythmic rustling of the branches above began to resonate deep within her chest. At first, it was a whisper, a faint vibration she could barely perceive, but over days and nights, it grew into a steady current, as if the forest itself had become a part of her very being. Her sorrow, once sharp and unrelenting, began to transform. Each pang of betrayal, each memory of cruelty, became a source of focus and clarity, weaving together with the living energy around her. As she wandered the woods, Ayana noticed her senses sharpening. The faintest movement of a leaf, the distant call of a bird, the subtle shift in the undergrowth, all spoke to her with unmistakable clarity. She no longer feared the shadows. Instead, she felt the presence of life within them. Small animals approached her without hesitation, recognizing a bond they had sensed growing stronger day by day. Roots seemed to part at her approach, and vines would rise to gently guide her path or cradle her when she rested. It was as if the forest acknowledged her pain, recognized her resilience, and was investing its ancient power into her very essence. Ayana's hands began to respond to the forest's will in ways that startled her. Touching a fallen branch or a patch of earth would cause subtle changes. The ground seemed to soften beneath her, flowers bloomed where her fingers brushed the soil, and small streams shifted gently, aligning with her movements. She realized, with awe and a hint of fear, that her connection to the forest was not passive. The sorrow and rage that had once weighed her down were now transforming into something potent, a force that could bend the natural world to protect and defend. Her emotions, once chaotic and uncontrollable, became a conduit for power. The grief of betrayal sparked a protective instinct that flowed outward, intertwining with the energy of the trees, the wind, and the creatures around her. The forest's magic no longer felt separate. It pulsed through her veins and she could sense its ancient wisdom guiding her. She discovered she could move silently, anticipate the shifts of the terrain, and sense threats before they became apparent. Each moment of calm meditation beneath the canopy strengthened this bond, allowing her pain to become a source of strength rather than weakness. As weeks passed, Ayana's physicality transformed subtly alongside her growing connection to the forest. Her movements became more fluid, almost predatory, and her reflexes sharper than ever. She could leap over tangled roots with ease, navigate treacherous terrain effortlessly, and sense the presence of beings, human or animal, approaching from miles away. The forest taught her patience, observation, and harmony with the world around her. It was not mere survival, it was a symbiosis. She gave herself to the forest, and in return, it imbued her with resilience and a deep-seated power that resonated with the ancient energy surrounding her. Ayana also discovered that her thoughts could influence subtle changes in the environment. Focusing on protection, she could guide vines to entwine around intruders or form gentle barriers. Concentrating on light, she could coax hidden sunbeams to filter through dense foliage, illuminating hidden paths. Her emotions acted as catalysts, and the forest responded to her intent with precision, reinforcing the notion that her pain had become a powerful tool. The betrayal that had once crushed her spirit now fueled a connection that was almost supernatural in its depth and breadth. The transformation was not merely physical or magical, it was emotional and psychological. Ayana began to shed fear, replacing it with determination and self-assurance. She no longer saw herself as a helpless victim abandoned by her family. Instead, she recognized herself as a part of something larger, an embodiment of the forest's memory, strength, and wisdom. Her compassion for the creatures and plants around her deepened, and her understanding of the interconnectedness of all living things grew. She could feel the pulse of life in the smallest insects and the oldest trees alike, and she understood instinctively that every element of the forest was tied to her own survival and growth. By the end of this period, Ayana stood taller, her eyes bright with an inner light that mirrored the energy coursing through the forest. Her pain, once raw and paralyzing, had transformed into a source of power that commanded nature itself. The wind answered her unspoken questions, the trees swayed in rhythm with her intent, and the smallest creatures acted as allies rather than passive observers. She had become the living heart of the forest, a guardian and a force to be reckoned with. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer merely a child betrayed and abandoned. She was a conduit for the ancient power of the woods, a being whose pain had become a force capable of commanding the very essence of nature to rise in her defense.